They used to laugh when you didn't speak. They mistook your silence for weakness. They interpreted your calm as confusion. They saw your hesitation and assumed it was fear. And maybe, for a while, they were right. Maybe you were afraid of confrontation, afraid of being misunderstood, afraid that if you opened your mouth, you wouldn't be able to hold back everything that had been sitting in your chest for years. So you stayed quiet. And because you stayed quiet, they underestimated you. They filled the silence with their own voices, their own narratives. They projected onto you what they needed to believe, that you were soft, that you were naive, that you were safe to dismiss. But silence doesn't mean surrender. Stillness doesn't mean absence. And what they never understood is that while they were using their noise to prove something, you were using your silence to build something. Because silence, real silence, is not passive. It's charge. It's the space where you reclaim power, word by word, boundary by boundary, breath by breath. It's the ground where false identities crumble and true presence begins. And you were doing just that, quietly, patiently, without fanfare or applause. You were observing reading between every word, every facial twitch, every energetic shift in the room. You were learning the difference between people who speak to be heard and those who speak because they've actually listened. You stopped explaining yourself, not because you had nothing to say, but because you finally realized not everyone deserves to hear you. That shift was invisible at first. They didn't notice it right away. After all, you still showed up. You still nodded. You still smiled politely. But you had already started pulling your energy back. You were no longer placing your value in being agreeable. You were no longer shrinking yourself to keep the peace. You were no longer performing emotional labor just to avoid discomfort. You became quiet, but dense. Your presence thickened. Your words fewer, but heavier. And suddenly, they felt it. They couldn't name it. They couldn't point to anything obvious. But they started noticing that the energy had shifted. The dynamic they used to rely on, the one where you played small so they could feel big, was gone. And that terrified them. Because people who relied on your silence as a cushion for their ego don't know what to do when you stop cushioning. They don't know what to do when your stillness isn't permission, but a declaration. They don't know what to do when your eyes say, "I see you," and you say nothing else. Because silence, once it's reclaimed, becomes a weapon. Not to harm, but to protect. And protection has never looked louder. You're not louder, but you're clearer. You're not confrontational, but you're no longer accessible in the same way. You're not cold, but the warmth you once gave so freely now comes with discernment. You've stopped volunteering for roles you never agreed to play. You've stepped off the emotional stage that they kept casting you into. And now, your silence is no longer the absence of noise. It's the presence of power. It's the reason they feel uneasy when you walk into a room and say nothing. It's the reason they reread your short replies like they're encrypted messages. It's the reason they say, "You've changed," because they can no longer predict your reaction. And they're right. You have changed. You no longer need to be understood in order to feel valid. You no longer need to be liked to feel safe. You no longer need to fight to be seen, because you've already seen yourself. And once you've seen yourself, the approval of others starts to feel cheap. That's what scares them. Not your words, not your actions, not even your withdrawal, but the fact that you no longer need to explain your evolution, that you no longer hand out emotional updates, that you no longer argue your worth. Because once you stop performing, once you stop proving, your energy begins to speak in a language that only truth can understand. And that language, it's silent. It says, "I no longer seek validation in the places where I once begged for it." It says, "I don't need your approval because I'm no longer for sale." It says, "I'm not angry. I'm not bitter. I'm just no longer available to be underestimated." And when you reach that place, that quiet, powerful, steady place, the people who thrived on your insecurity begin to tremble. Not because you've become aggressive, but because you've become unreadable. And people fear what they can't control. They fear the person who no longer reacts, who no longer explains, who no longer shows up in the same predictable rhythm. Because when your silence becomes intentional, when it's no longer the result of suppression, but the result of sovereignty, Everything that once used to work against you no longer applies. You've become a presence they didn't account for. And now they have to deal with that present, without access, without control, without the leverage they once had. And maybe they'll call you cold. Maybe they'll say you're arrogant now. Maybe they'll say you're distant, too proud, too much. Let them. Because none of those words matter anymore. What matters is that you know the difference between a silence rooted in fear and a silence rooted in power. And what you found is the second one. You don't need to raise your voice. You are the volume now. At first, they didn't know what was different. They couldn't point to a change in tone or expression. You still showed up, still responded, still kept your movements quiet. But something in you was no longer reaching. You weren't reaching for approval. You weren't over-explaining your intention. You weren't rushing to fill the silence when things got uncomfortable. And that's when it started to happen. Not all at once, but slowly, subtly. The people who used to speak over you started watching what they said. The ones who used to push your limits began to tread carefully. They couldn't explain why, but your presence no longer felt safe, not for them. Because your silence was no longer a pause, it had become a boundary, and that boundary, invisible but undeniable, began to shift the entire dynamic. They tried to provoke you, like before, poke at the old triggers, bring up the past, challenge your tone, your reactions, your identity, but you didn't bite. You didn't engage in the same patterns. You didn't explain, defend, justify, or apologize. You just stayed still, unmoved, rooted, and that, more than anything, unnerved them. Because people who rely on control, whether emotionally, psychologically, or energetically, aren't afraid of chaos. They're afraid of lack of access. And you, without saying a word, had closed the door. You didn't slam it. You didn't make a dramatic exit. You simply stopped being available for manipulation. And when someone loses access to the version of you they could manipulate, they panic. Not outwardly, not immediately, but something in their foundation begins to crack. Because their power over you was never about strength. It was about habit. You were predictable. You gave them what they expected. Your guilt, your empathy, your energy. You danced when they pulled the strings, but now the strings hang loose. And your stillness becomes a mirror they didn't ask for, a mirror they can't escape, a mirror that reflects exactly what they projected and no longer receives it, because you're not reflecting back approval anymore. You're not offering softness just because the moment feels tense. You're not dimming yourself to protect their comfort. You've stopped translating your essence into a version of you they could digest. And that translation, that old, exhausting spiritual code switching, was their lifeline. Now, it's gone. And what's left is confrontation. Not of your doing, but of theirs. They're being forced to face the fact that the person they dismissed, mocked, or underestimated was never weak. Just watching. They're being forced to reckon with the fact that the person they thought they could keep under their thumb has disappeared. Not physically, but vibrationally. You don't exist in their emotional loop anymore. You don't occupy the same frequency. You don't feel small around them. Not because they changed, but because you did. And in your change, their power evaporated. Because control can only exist where insecurity lives. And you're not insecure anymore. You're aware. You're calm. You're grounded in a self that no longer depends on external validation to feel solid. And that solidity? It's unsettling for those who benefited from your fragmentation. They don't know how to handle you now. You don't cry the same way. You don't beg. You don't chase. You don't ask for understanding because you've realized that being understood was never the path to liberation. Understanding was the leash, and you cut it. They still expect you to show up like before, to fold when pressure hits, to explain yourself in circle, to play emotional chess until they feel like they've won something. But you've left the board. You're not playing anymore, not out of resentment, not out of ego, but out of clarity. And clarity has made you light, so light, in fact, that their guilt slides off you like oil on glass. Their attempts to draw you back into the game fall flat. Their just checking in texts don't pierce. Their silence doesn't sting, because you don't need their noise to feel seen. You see yourself now. You don't need their apology to feel whole. You've already given yourself closure. You don't need their permission to evolve. You've already walked through the fire and chosen to keep going. That choice is what they never expected. They expected you to hurt, to rage, to crumble. But you did that part in private. You fell apart in silence. And now, you've rebuilt, not with noise, but with depth. They feel that depth when they speak to you now, even if you don't say much, even if you just smile and nod, because energy never lies, and your energy is no longer accessible to anyone who can't match it. That's not arrogance, it's spiritual discernment, and your discernment is what's causing the shift, not your words, not your actions, but your absence from the patterns that used to define you. And this absence, it echoes louder than any performance ever could. There's a specific kind of discomfort that comes over people when you stop reacting. They don't say it. They don't even always recognize it, but it's there. Beneath their casual smiles, beneath the awkward pauses, beneath the sudden change in tone when they realize you're not flinching anymore. Your silence is no longer a void they can fill with dominance. It's not an opening for manipulation, guilt, or passive aggression. It's a wall they can't climb because it's made of something untouchable. It's made of self-ownership, and that's what they never prepared for. They thought your silence was submission. They thought your stillness was hesitation. They thought your empathy was permission to disrespect your boundary. They were wrong, because what they're facing now is a version of you that sees every move they make and simply does not respond. And that is terrifying, because people who thrive on control need a reaction to exist. They need your energy, your defense, your emotional participation. Even your anger, especially your anger, gives them something to work with. But now, you're no longer giving them anything. No more over-explaining. No more justifying your choice. No more trying to prove that your boundaries are reasonable. You've stopped trying to be the nice version of yourself just to avoid being labeled cold. You've stopped negotiating with your own instinct just to stay in someone's good graces. You've stopped handing over your power in the name of being understood. Now, you just look. You observe. You breathe, slowly, deeply, unapologetically. And that breath carries more power than any monologue you could give, because that breath says, I don't owe you my softness if it costs me my peace. You've shifted from reaction to discernment. You no longer respond to energy that's trying to hook you back into dysfunction. You no longer get dragged into old conversations that spiral into nothing but frustration, because now your peace is not just a preference, it's a requirement. And this requirement rewires everything. You don't ghost people, you just stop leaking energy. You don't announce your departure. You simply stop performing your old role. You don't create drama, but your silence forces everyone to feel what the noise was covering. They begin to notice how uncomfortable they are in your absence, how restless they become when they can't predict you, how unsettled they feel when they realize you are no longer available to validate their behavior. It's not punishment, it's precision. You've become precise with your time, precise with your energy, precise with your boundary, precise with your emotional currency. Because you've realized something that changes everything. You are the resource, not your help, not your support, not your ability to fix things. You, your presence, your insight, your ability to hold space. It's valuable, and it's no longer free for those who don't value it. So when someone approaches you with old tactics, when they try to bait you with passive remarks or silence games or subtle guilt trips, they're met with nothing, just your calm, your breath, your groundedness. And that groundedness shakes them, because it means you're not reacting, because you no longer care the same way, not in a cruel sense, but in a clean, clear, liberated way. You still have compassion, but it's no longer wrapped in obligation. You still have empathy, but it's no longer self-destructive. You still care, but you don't overgive just to avoid tension. And that balance, that fierce, quiet clarity, feels like thunder to those who only understood you through your willingness to overextend. Your power now lives in the pauses, in the breath you take before responding, in the glance that speaks louder than 1,000 justifications. And they feel it. They feel the drop in control. They feel the shift in hierarchy. They feel the weight of their own actions now that your energy is no longer cushioning the blow. You've become a mirror that doesn't distort, a mirror that doesn't flatter, a mirror that simply reflects what is. And that, more than anything, is what they can't handle. Because when your silence reflects truth, people are forced to hear their own noise. When your stillness reveals the chaos they tried to project onto you, they have no one left to blame. And when your energy says, "I know exactly who I am, and I don't need you to confirm it," there is nothing left for them to control. That is the most powerful place you've ever stood. Not above anyone, not against anyone, but so deeply within yourself that no external voice can pull you out again. They thought silence meant surrender. They never imagined silence could mean power. They're used to noise, used to chaos, used to people proving, defending, unraveling under pressure. They're used to emotional leverage, where the loudest voice wins, where the most dramatic pain commands attention, where manipulation passes for connection. But then, you stopped responding. You stopped defending your name. You stopped rushing to clarify what your silence meant. And now, they're the ones who are loud, not you. They're the ones sending longer messages. They're the ones asking what changed. They're the ones over-explaining, making sure they're still relevant to a version of you that no longer exists. Because when someone is used to accessing your energy without earning it, the day you close the door feels like abandonment to them, even if they were the ones who left you emotionally abandoned for years. And it hits hard, not because you're being cold, but because your calm now carries weight. It's not just your words they miss. It's the feeling of having a version of you they could decode. You were reliable in your self-doubt, in your overthinking, in your emotional availability. You were easy to read. Now, you're unreadable, and unreadable is terrifying to people who relied on your predictability to feel powerful. They don't understand the version of you who no longer apologizes for existing. They don't recognize the you who doesn't explain away your emotions like they're inconveniences. They don't trust the silence because, for the first time, they can't twist it. They try to bait you. A vague comment, a calculated withdrawal, a sudden resurfacing, but none of it works anymore because you're no longer playing chess with ghosts. And when you refuse to engage in emotional strategy, you rob them of the only thing they know how to use: reaction. Your silence has become a confrontation, not because you intended it to be, but because it exposes what the noise used to hide. It exposes the power game. It exposes the imbalance. It exposes the fact that your presence was always the glue. And now, without it, things fall apart. They used to underestimate you because your power wasn't loud. But now, that quiet strength they overlooked has become a boundary they can't cross. And that is the fear, not your anger, not your revenge, not your threats, but your absence. Your absence from the emotional battlefield. Your absence from the conversations that go nowhere. Your absence from their story, one where you were once cast as the supporting role in their drama. Now, they see it for what it is. They never truly had power. They had access, and that access is gone. Gone, not in a storm, not in a speech, but in your simple refusal to keep bleeding where you were never being bandaged. You stopped offering explanation. You stopped being available to misunderstanding. You stopped pouring your spirit into places that offered nothing but confusion in return. And your silence became your protection. Not a wall, but a field. One they can't cross unless they rise to meet you where you are now. And most won't. Because what you've done takes courage. It takes an unimaginable amount of self-respect to remain calm in the face of chaos, to hold your ground when everything in you wants to explain, to sit in your knowing when every part of your past identity screams for validation. But you've done it. You are doing it. And now, your energy tells a different story, one that doesn't rely on words to be heard. You walk into rooms and something shifts. Not because you've become arrogant, but because you've become aligned. Not because you seek attention, but because you carry the kind of frequency that can't be ignored. And that frequency? It demands truth, not through confrontation, but through reflection. You've become a mirror now, And mirrors make people uncomfortable because they don't show what you tell yourself. They show what's really there. And in your presence, people are forced to meet the parts of themselves they've spent years avoiding. That's why your silence feels so loud. It says everything without saying a word. It says, I no longer betray myself to keep the peace. I no longer prove my softness through sacrifice. I no longer mistake access for intimacy. It says, I see myself clearly now, and I don't need you to agree. And in a world addicted to validation, in relationships built on energetic dependence, that kind of clarity is deeply unsettling because it breaks the cycle, it severs the loop, it ends the story, not with a bang, but with the quiet, unshakable decision to no longer play the part they cast you in. And now, they have to sit with the silence they once demanded. They have to face the absence they once dismissed. They have to witness your becoming from outside the circle they once assumed they controlled. They still don't understand what changed. You didn't shout. You didn't expose anyone. You didn't storm out of rooms or post dramatic declarations. You simply stopped needing to be seen in order to exist. And that changed everything. Because when you no longer rely on external validation to confirm your worth, you start to carry a frequency that doesn't seek. It commands, not through force, not through ego, but through sheer alignment. You walk into spaces now, and the atmosphere subtly shifts. People sense something different. They can't describe it, but they feel it. You don't look angry. You don't look bitter. You just look finished. Finished with the noise. Finished with the roles. Finished with the game of spiritual shape-shifting to be digestible. There is no longer a need to prove you're good, kind, smart, worthy, forgiving, strong. You are, and your knowing is enough. That knowing is what terrifies the ones who once underestimated you, because they were prepared for your fight. They were ready for your reaction. They had comebacks for your explanations, defenses for your anger, arguments for your emotion, but they never expected your absence to carry this much weight. They never imagined that not engaging could be louder than any confrontation. They never predicted that your lack of reaction would feel like a mirror they could no longer escape. Because now, your silence doesn't feel empty. It feels full. It vibrates with every word you no longer need to say. It contains decades of self-betrayal you've alchemized into clarity. It holds the version of you they hoped would never awaken, the version that doesn't bend anymore. You don't need to block them. You don't need to clap back. You don't need to post cryptic quotes or write long paragraphs of closure. You're not interested in telling your story to people who made themselves deaf when you were trying to speak from pain. You no longer need to explain why you're gone. You are gone, not in body, but in energy. And energy is what they never realized mattered most. They still try to reach you sometimes, not always directly. A like, a vague message, a third-hand question, little digital flares to test if they still have a grip on you. But they don't, because you're no longer touchable by the same hands that held you down in silence. And now, your silence protects you. It's the armor they can't penetrate, the evidence they can't delete, the version of you they can't access, decode, or manipulate. This new version of you is no longer loud because it doesn't need the world's permission to exist. You've learned how to sit with your truth until it no longer burns. It simply radiates. And radiance is different from reaction. Radiance doesn't chase. It doesn't ask for space. It creates space. It doesn't perform to be believed. It just is. And those who once needed you small, agreeable, and unsure, they are the most unsettled by this new version of you, because it proves something they were never ready to accept. You didn't need them. You needed you. And now that you have yourself, fully, deeply, irrevocably, you walk with a kind of authority that can't be taught. It's not the kind that comes from titles, not from applause, not from curated aesthetics or spiritual jargon. It comes from wholeness, and wholeness doesn't play the same games brokenness had to in order to survive. So you're quiet, but your boundaries speak clearly. You're soft, but your energy is unshakable. You're kind, but not available for misuse. You're forgiving, but you've rewritten the access code. And most of all, you are done performing pain to be seen. That's what breaks the loop forever. Because many people don't love you. They love the version of you that stays accessible through guilt. They love the version of you that keeps explaining why you deserve respect. They love the version of you who translates your soul into their language. But you've stopped speaking their language. You've chosen your native tongue now. Silence, presence, boundaries, peace. And those who truly resonate with you, they hear it loud and clear. They feel your energy and don't flinch. They understand the power behind your stillness. They don't need you to explain your glow. They've walked through their own fire too. And in that shared knowing, you are no longer alone, because your silence has become a signal, a beacon to others who also stopped performing, a quiet call to those who carry peace as rebellion and self-respect as their new native rhythm. This is your return, not to the version of you who was pleasing until you disappeared into everyone else's expectations, but to the one who stayed silent long enough to finally hear your own voice rise from underneath the wreckage. And when that voice finally spoke, you didn't need to shout. You just existed differently, and that has said everything.